Book of Job is maybe the one book of the Old Testament that stands out among all the others because it's a commentary between a man who's suffering and all of his friends who have different ideas about why he's suffering. And he's trying to search out how a good God, a great God, could allow him to suffer. Today in our passage, we have that great line that was picked up in the New Testament. It came to mean new things to Christians. I know that my Redeemer lives. That's become a great affirmation on Easter Sunday. A time when we put death and evil behind us and we grab a hold of the life that God intends for us. That we understand how much God loves us. The book of Job is about the Christian journey. The Christian journey to turn into our suffering, to accept that God suffers with us, and to understand what God is like. When I hear that great line in Handel's Messiah, there's toward the end a soprano voice. I know that my Redeemer lives. And it's about resurrection. That's how maybe you have become familiar with that phrase, even though you may not have realized it came from Job in the middle of his struggling over suffering and evil. Jesus Christ Superstar has a very similar song on the lips of Jesus in those famous words from the cross. Oh Lord, why have you forsaken me? Great song that Jesus offers up, calling out to God from the cross. And this is the heart of Christianity. I want to tell you kind of a personal story this morning to help you to understand Job's perplexity and his crying out, I know that my Redeemer lives. First church that I ever served was in a town called Plum Hill in southern Illinois. And when we moved in, there were 18 people who lived in town. The nearest town was 7 miles away, and they had about a 10-bed hospital with an emergency room, and beyond that you had to drive at least 30 miles to get to the next nearest hospital. And as my habit was, I would go out calling during the day, and I'd come back, and on one of those days, I walked into the parsonage, and it was in an uproar. The parsonage was in an uproar. And my son Luke had been helping his grandmother make cookies in the kitchen. And he had pulled a chair up to the counter and had been standing on the chair, and he was reaching for something, and he lost his balance and he fell off. Unfortunately, at the time that he fell off, there was a bottom wooden drawer that had been partially pulled out so that it was out. And when he fell, his cheek hooked in the side of the drawer as he fell and tore part of his cheek open. And there was blood all over the floor of the kitchen, and people were yelling and screaming, not knowing what to do. It must have happened just before I got home that day. So I scooped him up in my arms, I ran to the car, I drove the 7 miles down an old windy country road into town to an emergency room that never had a physician staff in it. They had to call him on the phone if something happened. So they called him on the phone, and fortunately he happened to be home at the time. So by the time he got there, we're trying to keep the bleeding down and trying to keep him calm, and the doctor brought out this great big surgical blanket that had a little hole in it. Some of you have seen those little surgical blankets, and he said, I'm going to have to put this over his head, and I have to put it so that I can just see the opening where I'm going to put the stitches in his cheek. And he said, you're going to have to hold him down. This was, one of those things, you don't have anybody else around, so the family has to do these things. So I'm holding my 2-year-old son down on the operating table, and he's got this little hole, and he's screaming, Daddy, Daddy. sheep, "Daddy, Daddy," and he looks up to you with those tear-stained eyes, why are you holding me down? But there was also something in his eyes that knew that if I thought this was the right thing to do, then he would be okay. And at the end of that procedure, he jumped in my arms and didn't leave for the rest of the day. And I kind of wonder if that's not a model of what Job was going through when he said, "I know my Redeemer lives. I know that God loves us. I know that my suffering is not the end. I know that death itself is not the end because God loves me." And it's a wonderful thing when we're able to honor people's lives and recognize how important and how beloved they are of God. And so today we look at the world differently because we know what life is. And we know how much God loves us. And so with Job today, we can say, "I know that my Redeemer lives." Amen.